Heyo! What's goodies in these hoodies? I'm re-recording this tutorial because it was gonna bother me if I left that one up with the glitching audio. So today we are going to do Ariel Reichstaid. He's the producer on the Charli XCX song "Doing It." He's probably one of the producers. I don't remember who the other ones are. But this song carries a lot of his like signature moves that he's been doing with like Haim or the previous Charli XCX album or Sky Ferriera, however you say her name. I don't remember. So we're gonna do the keys sound on Doing It, and I'm gonna A/B them real quick so you know whether or not to stick around through Ableton. So here we go. Top one, obviously Reason. Second one is the track. So we were hopping between them right there. We're doing the keys, you know, the pad-ish kind of sound with the bell on top that you're hearing throughout that that section right there. So I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna close Ableton and reboot Reason so that we don't get any glitching audio because just to play it safe this time. So let me close everything we have going on here and reopen it all. Alright, so here's the Doing It project session. What was going on here was I was bored one day and I was thinking that I was going to recreate the whole song, so I made all these drum sounds and was building the whole song trying to make it sound exactly like the original for educational purposes, and I got bored and only got as far as these drum sounds, which are not perfect but pretty good sounding, and these keys which are perfect. So that's what we're gonna do a little tutorial on, a change of pace perhaps from what we've been doing in other tutorials. So what we're gonna need today to follow along exactly, although, you know, hopefully if you watch these tutorials you learn the concepts, you can apply it to anything, is we're going to be using Antidote to do a lot of the heavy lifting, and then actually on the bell sound we're going to be using Polar to do a feedback trick that is pretty necessary, and the rest of the stuff can get substituted pretty easily, but I'm not sure how you do this feedback trick inside of Reason easily without Polar. So that's probably the only real prerequisite that you're gonna need. Alright, so I'm gonna make a new project file here. I'm gonna paste over the MIDI data so that we can listen along to what we're doing really easily while we're building the sound. Sweet. So these are gonna be the keys. This is going to be the bell, and I'm going to put them where they were in the mix when I A/B'd it so that it sounds the same really fast. Okie dokie. Here we go. So let's start with the keys sound here. So let's load up an instance of Antidote. And actually what we're going to need here, if you want to load it all in at the start, we're going to need utilities. We're going to load in a line 6 mixer so that we can have two antidotes, because we are actually going to be using two antidotes, and the reason we're going to do that is because we're going to be doing a triple octave spread of the notes but they're not going to be the same volume. So what I mean by that is Antidote has I don't know what the DYAD stands for, but it has a function where you can literally just duplicate the voices at a certain semitone distance. So this would be like a minor third, a major third, a perfect fourth, perfect fifth, an octave, it's so on and so forth. But you can't change the volume of these new voices, which kind of sucks. It would save a lot of CPU space if we didn't need a second antidote here. But no big deal. No big deal. Okay, so we're going to start with some digital saws, 6 voices. We do the detuning so that we can spread them out across the stereo field and get a nice wide pad sound that's going to fill out the track. We bring the detune down so that it's a slower kind of detune. The phasing that's going to be happening is slower. It's more like the Porter Robinson tutorial. If you go watch the Porter Robinson tutorial, oh man. And that's pretty much all we're going to do for oscillator 1. Oscillator 2, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to get our digital saw. We're going to add 6 voices. We're going to spread them. We're going to detune them a little bit less than 50%, which is going to make the phasing much slower and more noticeable. And we're going to bring this oscillator down to like 20% in the mix, because this oscillator is going to be 12 semitones below, an octave below, and it's going to kind of fill out the underbelly of the pad here. So I'm going to hook this up so we can start listening to it. So I just turned that oscillator off. And you can hear it gives the whole thing a little bit more weight, but the weight is kind of perceptual. It's not like changing our perception of the pitch or where the body of the chords are coming from in the frequency spectrum. It's kind of just giving the whole thing more weight on a subconscious level, which is exactly what I want. Another thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to peak up the drift here to about 19–20%, and what that's going to do is simulate like an analog synthesizer where the voices can drift out of tune with each other, and that's going to contribute to the whole vintage feel that the song might have. It kind of has like an 80s kind of vibe to it, and this is just reflective of Ariel Reichstad's kind of style. He's very into invoking an 80s feel, and that vintagey kind of feel comes along with that like broken kind of feel, which is simulated with the oscillator drifting apart from each other. So that's just another little perceptual thing that you want to throw into your back pocket. Then we're going to move on to the low-pass 4-pole, not the silent key filter this time, the low-pass 4-pole, because that is a more analog-y style filter as well. And we're going to bring the cutoff down here to 70% because this is going to start acting like a plucked natural sound would behave in the real world. So in the real world, you know, you clap your hands, you know, it's bright at first, it dies down in both frequency and amplitude. You play a piano, it starts out bright, it dies down in both frequency, low-pass filter frequency cutoff and amplitude in real life. And that's the kind of motion that we're going to give to the sound here to kind of make it sound natural and alive and give it movement that makes the sound more interesting. Because obviously if you just have these chords going, it's not really that interesting. There's no dynamics to the sound, and dynamics is what makes everything interesting. Changes over time is what makes things interesting, which is why we even have these detune and phasing in the first place. So I'm going to bring the filter envelope down to 0 on the sustain, because the sustain is a level, and that means that the level is going to be at 70%. I'm going to bring the envelope to, like, I don't know, really small amount, like 11 or something, 12. And the decay I'm going to bring up to about half a second, 632 milliseconds, and the release a second long, let's say. And let's see what that sounds like now. So now you can hear there's like a pluck happening a really subtle, nice, gentle pluck happening that is indicative of how a real sound behaves over time. More energy in the beginning creates a transient, less energy in the end. And we're going to simulate that, we're going to mimic that as well with the amplitude envelope by bringing the sustain all the way down, our decay to about 4 seconds or so, give it a little bit of a tack because that's present in the original patch. And we're also going to buff up the release, like so. So it rings out for a little bit. Very, very nice sounding. And these amplitude envelopes, these envelopes in general, you will adjust depending on the tempo of your song to make them ring out for the amount of time that you need to for it to make sense in the chord progression. But it really makes sense these times here. Kind of dies out right before the next one's going to come in. And just makes the whole thing more lively. Right on, brother. So now we're going to add some chorus, which is going to add to the 80s feel of everything we have going on here, create some more deconstructive, constructive interference, some more phasing, some more movement, and it's going to be really good. We're just going to leave that on the stock settings in Antidote, but usually if you load up any chorus device, the stock settings are going to be good to go. We can get into chorus and what all these parameters mean on another video if you want. But these are good to go right now for the purpose of this sound. I'm also going to engage the reverb here because reverb, especially the reverb that's built into Antidote, this kind of algorithmic reverb, is a huge part of generating vibes and moodiness, and especially that 80s aesthetic that is so present in these songs that this guy makes. So we're throwing the reverb on there. The only change to these stock parameters that we're going to make is we're going to bring the time down to 1 second. We don't need a long reverb here to muddy things up. We just want to give the pad a sense of space. Alrighty, Roo, brother. So there is another component to the sound that is really, really subtle, but also really, really important. And that is this second antidote here, and what we're going to do with that. So the second antidote is going to be our triple octave spread that I was talking about. We currently have a 2-octave spread. We have the first octave here, a lower octave here, and now we're going to get an upper octave from oscillator 1 here. So oscillator 2 on antidote 2 is going to be bumped up to plus 12 semitones, and that's going to create our triple octave spread. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to load in some pulse waves with the modifier of 50%, which is going to create a full-on square wave without any differences in like pulse length, so to speak. The on-off is going to be 50-50. And we're going to give this 2 voices, also with a nice slower detune. We're going to bring the oscillator volume down to about 33%, 30 to 35%, wherever you want to put it. And what this is going to do is going to add in the frequency spectrum so here is the main pitch elements of our pad. We are going to be adding a little bit of harmonic content up here with the octave spread. It's all going to go around here. And that's just going to make the sound more interesting and give it a different timbral texture in the high end, which is why we need to blend it in. We don't want it to detract from where the actual pitches are coming from. We just want to use it as like harmonic fairy dust that's going to change the timbre of our sound. Which is something I used to see a lot of people do wrong, both when I worked at DubSpot and when I watch other people produce. And it's not wrong. You can do full octave spreads with equal amplitudes, but think about how you could use it in different ways, like changing the amplitude relationship between the octave voices to use them as more of like a timbral processor and not an actual pitch processor, if that makes sense. So we're going to mimic the envelopes of the previous synth right here. We're actually not going to use the filter envelope on this one, but we are going to make the amp envelope pretty much identical to what was before. I'm going to add some reverb with the time at a second. We're going to hook it up, and we're going to use the mix knob down here to blend it in halfway. Can't believe I heard that. That was off. Huh. Now it's not anymore. That's super subtle, but I promise I heard it in the original track when I made this patch. So this is the main patch of the bed of the sound. One last thing that we can do to increase the vintagey vibe is we can hook it up to an Audiomatic transformer or a Scream 4 tape distortion, but we're going to be using the tape setting here. And this just adds if we crank up the transform all the way, it doesn't really add any low pass-ish, but it adds tape distortion, analog style distortion, square clip the waveform a little bit, add a little bit of harmonics, add beefy to the low end, and do a little bit of compression, as well as a little bit of darkness to the sound, and that all adds to more of a vintage, warmer kind of vibe. And that's the main pad sound right here. Right on. So let's move on to the bell. And the bell is a little bit more complicated, but it's not really complicated. You're just gonna have to you're just gonna have to let your ears get used to this effect, so that you can recognize when you hear it, and you can use it on your own outside of this tutorial, obviously. So, if I'm making a bell sound in a subtractive synthesizer, which I am right now, I like to start out with a sine wave, because, you know, right off the bat, if I load in a sine wave in here, gonna add 2 octaves above. It's like instant bell timbre if we do that. I can also add in this little bit of sub. It's kind of unnecessary. I won't even add that in. It's not even perceivable, I don't think. But I will go over to the second oscillator and turn on this glass waveform to get a little bit of more belly glass happening. Bump this up 12. So when creating bell sounds, it's all about these upper harmonics. You have all these sinusoidal components that kind of make your brain perceive a bell kind of timbre. And all we got to do after that is mess with the amplitude envelope a little bit, kind of mimic what we have going on in the first one, a much shorter amplitude envelope. Kind of leave it like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to start to actually create the interesting part of the sound using polar, which Reason calls a dual pitch shifter. It's really just a delay with pitch capabilities. It's also kind of like a granular synthesizer if I... It's one of my favorite rack extensions, and there's nothing else like it inside of Reason. You can't really do these effects inside of Reason anywhere else. So the way we're going to use it is we're going to use it as a really high kind of comb filtery feedback delay. So I'm going to engage the dry signal so the dry signal comes through at full volume. I'm going to use the second pitch shifter and put it up 12 semitones, because if I put it up 12 semitones and engage this feedback, we start to get this really kind of like crystalline effect, which you can hear in a lot of arca sounds, believe it or not. Then I'm going to bring the volume down to like here to kind of blend it in. I'm also going to engage the second pitch shifter and leave that where it is because this has a delay on it inherently, and that kind of creates this kind of slapbacky, kind of echoey kind of sound. So you'll see we're getting this really kind of crystally kind of feel happening now. I'm going to accentuate that crystally kind of feel and drag it out longer than the amplitude envelope says that it should go by adding a echo. 50% dry wet, since we're doing it all in-house, we're not using any send effects on here. And we're going to turn the sync off and bring the delay down to like 40 milliseconds, and this is going to be really, really short, kind of like that slapbacky, feedbacky echo kind of thing. We're going to turn the feedback up a huge amount as well. Maybe a little bit of diffusion. So now you can kind of hear it's almost like a reverb in a sense, but it's also accentuating all the feedback and delay that we had generated from the Polar and kind of extending that out across a longer period of time. The next thing we can do is add a little bit of reverb to bring some more cohesion. I'm going to load up the fairy tale preset again, just like Sun and Moon. Fairy tale. And the reason I'm choosing this preset is for all the reasons that I chose it last time. It's a bright reverb, it's a long reverb, it's an 80s kind of reverb. I'm going to bring the decay down though, way down. Dry wet 50% since this is not on a send channel, so we're blending it in-house. Leave the high frequencies where they are. I can bump up the pre-delay to kind of give a gap in between when the delay starts and when the delay starts and when the, why am I blanking right now? My brain's fried. And when the reverb starts. I'm going to change the operation to direct to make it kind of longer sounding. And I'm going to call it a day there, except I'm going to add an Audiomatic transformer again with some tape style distortion to kind of bring the whole thing together and kind of hit it on the vintagey kind of feel. I can vintage it up even more by bringing in a Blandsoft resampler, or if I pulled up Scream 4 distortion, the digital form of distortion, because a lot of 80s gear had much lower sampling rates, something like, we can go like half the sampling rate and not as much bit depth to introduce some noise into the signal to vintage it up as well. But that's a creative decision on your part. These different resample and downsampler settings all kind of play with anti-aliasing filters to kind of either remove the aliasing artifacts with ideal low-pass filtering at the Nyquist frequency, or they kind of let the aliasing come through to add to the timbre of the sound. So that's pretty much the whole shindig right here. The bell sound is definitely a little bit more complicated with the feedbacks to kind of give it that shimmery kind of feel. But overall, not too bad, not too bad. Really useful sounds, really good sounds. Turn off the aliasing. Just bumped up the feedback on the echo here, and I actually like the way that sounds a lot. So yeah, that is pretty much it. That's pretty much the whole tutorial. If I throw in the drums over here in the original project file. And that's your Charli XCX doing it, keys, pads, bell sound, produced by Ariel, Reichstaid, and probably a few other people. And I will see you guys in the next one.